Hello, everyone. You're watching this recording because I've been summoned to jury duty. I've been on callback over the last couple of days, but this evening I did get the official summons, so I have to report tomorrow. So I'm very sorry not to be there in person. Well, at least live over Zoom, especially for this particular set of papers, because I'm more confused by these papers than any set of papers we've read so far. So the discussion would have been particularly helpful for me. Anyway, thank you, Natalie and Tim, for letting me record my presentation. I just didn't want to risk doing it from the jury waiting room. There's too many unknown factors. So with that said, I'll go ahead and share screen. Oh, okay. So I'll be presenting on Turner and Tracy 1986. A pretty interesting, albeit confusing paper for me, where they broadly examined the relationship between body size, homeothermy, and mechanisms of heat exchange for mammal-like reptiles. And so since this paper is looking at extinct taxa, it's always helpful, at least for me, to look at the geologic timescale to get the broad picture. And so this paper was pretty much exclusively looking at a lineage of mammal-like reptiles in the Permian era. So the Permian era was 300 to 250 million years ago, a time of pretty rapid change for reptiles. There was a lot of reptile diversity coming onto the scene during the Permian, but also a lot of extinctions at the same time. And so this paper, Turner and Tracy, they were looking at one specific lineage of these mammal-like Permian reptiles. So that's shown right here, all one single evolutionary line. From the early Permian, things like pelycosaurs, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which were quite large-bodied, so on the order of 250 kilograms, way heavier than a human. To a little bit later on in the Permian, therapsids, so even larger, 250 kilograms plus. So I mean, some of these were, over a ton. Pretty large-bodied reptiles. This was before the evolution of the archosaurs or dinosaurs. So pretty interesting. But by the late Permian, really the transition time between the Permian and the Triassic, where dinosaurs first began to evolve, they were pretty small. These Permian reptiles. They'd gotten down the cynodonts, which means dog teeth. It's pretty interesting. They were pretty small, so they'd gotten quite, less than 50 kilograms. It's all the same evolutionary line. And so, relatively small body size, and these were the mammals that basically coexisted with the dinosaurs during the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. And so it's a pretty wide diversity of body sizes in this Permian line, but the largest of them were very large. And so this paper broadly posited, well, they weren't the first ones to posit it, they actually cited another paper, but they broadly were looking at this line of Permian mammal-like reptiles. And we're thinking about it in terms of, were these the organisms where homeothermy first began to come into play, where these are the first homeotherms. So they used this term inertial homeotherms. Were they the first inertial homeotherms? That's their main hypothesis. Again, not something that they explicitly hypothesized. They took that from another paper. So but they largely hypothesized that these large-bodied Permian reptiles were sort of necessity homeothermic, and they largely based this hypothesis on observations of extant taxa of reptiles, that they could have measured in the 1980s still could be measured today. So broadly speaking, large ectotherms of today have a lot less temperature variation, diurnal temperature variation, than small ones. And so this was, hypothetically true also for these Permian reptiles. Since they were large-bodied, they probably had more consistent body temperatures, basically homeothermic, relative to smaller reptiles that they would have co-occurred with. And so they specifically predicted then, again, this was before the evolution of dinosaurs even, they specifically predicted that these large-bodied mammal-like reptiles, even though they were homeothermic, they probably had internal body temperatures that were relatively low to mammals. Okay, so on the order of 30 to 35 degrees centigrade. And from that base prediction, they were exploring some really broad questions. So they wanted to think about what were the potential limitations of control that these organisms had over their heat exchange between their bodies and the environment. Maybe they were wrong. They thought, well, maybe higher body temperatures actually evolved before homeothermy in this line of Permian reptiles. Is that the case? That they also explored that, and then they explored potential mechanisms that these organisms might have used for controlling heat exchange between their bodies and the environment. And so they posited two broad methods of control over heat exchange that these organisms might have used. This was before they even got to their model. Firstly, they thought that behavioral thermoregulation was likely an important component of how they maintained their body temperature at a consistent level. And so basically seeking out optimal microclimates, kind of like those iguanas from the paper we were talking about on the Galapagos on Monday. It's basically altering their behavior to seek out thermal regimes that allowed them to maintain a consistent body temperature. So certain wind habits, for example, or certain water habits, certain aspects, certain slopes, all of those things in tangent with one another. They likely exhibited behaviors to get the right array of temperatures. But they spent most of their time thinking about regulating heat exchange in terms of their physiology, and they looked at mostly varying patterns of blood flow. And so they looked at this mostly in the context of where blood flow likely was regulated for these reptiles relative to the main core of their bodies, the torso, versus the appendages. And so they mostly predicted that that the appendages were likely the main way that they exerted control over heat exchange, as opposed to the torso. For base physiological reasons, larger surface volume ratios and smaller convective boundary layers in the appendages relative to the torso. So it basically having this variation gave them greater control. And so, considering both physiological blood flow as well as behavioral thermoregulation, they wanted to examine the relationship between the body size of these Permian mammal-like reptiles and their ability to effectively control heat exchanges, their heat exchange with the environment, mostly looking at it in terms of their appendages. And so they used this pretty interesting model, which I'll be upfront, I do not really understand. So I'm going to do my best here. They used this Biot number, which is basically a dimensionless number of heat exchange between bodies. So it's basically the ratio between internal and external heat resistance. So BI equals internal heat resistance divided by external heat resistance. So external heat resistance could be things like changes in wind speed, which is a factor of convection, or radiant heat load, which is of course a factor of radiation, versus internal resistance, which is mostly they looked at variation in blood flow within the body of these reptiles. So differences in torso and appendage convection. So they really wanted to know for these Permian reptiles, which was dominant, external resistance to heat flow or heat load, or internal. Because that would have determined total body temperature, right? Whether their bodies were had a high temperature or a low temperature for their homeothermy. And so a low Biot number would have meant that internal resistance was dominant, meaning that blood flow was the primary factor affecting total body temperature, whereas a high Biot number would have meant that external resistance was dominant, whereas things like wind speed and heat load, radiant heat load from the outside would have been the primary factor affecting total body temperature. And so they ran this model where they made various assumptions for temperature differential, wind speed, and blood flow. So they just put in some basic assumptions into the model, and used Biot numbers versus available torso lengths that they had based on, I'm assuming, fossil specimens. And so they ran this model, and they found that generally speaking, the Biot, as the torso length increased, here's the kind of the main figure here, as the torso length increased, the Biot number decreased. So that's what the model showed, which basically correlates to according to this model, these organisms may have been externally, the external resistance was likely the dominant factor affecting total body temperature. In other words, large body size for these Permian mammals, in other words, they were low temperature organisms. They likely did not have high temperature because they were external heat resistance dominance. So again, that's the best way I can explain it. Again, they still acknowledge that that's not necessarily, even though their model indicated that these homeotherms were likely had low body temperatures. They still posited some alternatives that, okay, for these large-bodied reptiles with low temperatures, how might they have increased their internal body temperatures, which has a whole array of life history advantages. So they pose two main ways that these reptiles may have increased their internal body temperature, largely as a way of, as a whole, increasing their internal resistance to heat transfer. So by increasing their internal resistance to heat transfer, they increased their ability to maintain higher body temperatures. So the first one that they thought of was changes in behavior. So they thought perhaps these organisms may have spent a lot of their time in windy places, places with really turbulent airflow, which would have given them hypothetically more control over their body temperature. It would have increased their internal resistance to heat transfer. Or like living in water as opposed to the air. So living in water, they thought decreased the convection resistance, which also would have given them more control over their body temperature. They also considered potential changes to body form. One thing I might point out is that before we get there, they were thinking that like modern day amphibia and even crocodilians, so things that hang out a lot in water, this is the same sort of life history tactic, hanging out a lot in water. It's basically a mechanism of controlling body temperature, among other things. And then secondly, they considered changes in body form. So for example, the development of ancillary appendages like long tails that had a function beyond mere locomotion, basically as a way of spreading heat across their bodies, or even being used as heat sinks. So to sort of spread out heat and maintain homeothermy across their bodies, but then also increase relative body temperature. And they also thought about modifying the shape of their locomotory appendages. So for here, in this particular image, I think this is a Dimetrodon. These were some of the first reptiles to develop kind of long, slender appendages that were kind of arrayed underneath them, as opposed to a lot of other reptiles which are out more toward the side, which did a number of things. It increased their weight. It altered the way their muscles move, which also influence their blood flow, which kind of goes back to what they were talking about earlier. Also potentially would have increased their internal resistance to heat transfer. So I think I'm getting close to over 5 minutes now. My interpretation of this paper is that it was well written, but I frankly had a hard time understanding it. It was clearly geared toward, and this is not really my system. It's really fascinating, but it was clearly geared toward a specific audience, people who already knew a lot of these terms. I had to spend a lot of time looking up a lot of these lineages of extinct species, because I just didn't know. They took it for granted that this was kind of known. They also based a lot of their modeling on conjecture, on modern day congruities, which I can't really blame them for. That's not really a criticism, because this seems to me to be a pretty seminal paper. Their concepts that they were exploring were pretty exploratory, as far as I can tell. I mean, they didn't have a lot of data to work with. They were pretty much working with a model, and the majority of their data came from either living reptiles or fossil specimens, and they were able to combine all that together to a pretty interesting model, a pretty basic model, but I think it had some pretty interesting predictions on the basis of that. And so they were pretty upfront about the limits of their model. They took some liberties, but that's what models are all about. So it was pretty interesting. Not really a weakness. A couple of things. They kind of going back to the changes in behavior and changes to body form. Their predictions of certain behaviors and morphologies, and how these may have altered, enabled these Permian reptiles to alter their homeothermy and their internal body temperatures relative to body size. I thought that was kind of broad. That could have been the result of a lot more than simply a vector to regulate heat exchange. Certainly, heat exchange, thermal regulation is very crucial, especially for these relatively early reptiles. But it just seemed to me to be pretty broad, to the point that they were looking at it in a very specific way. So again, I can't really blame them for that. Another thing was that I'm curious why they only were focused on this one lineage of mammal-like reptiles. Why didn't they compare to archosaurs, for example, of which dinosaurs and crocodiles are a part? They went to some length to emphasize that modern day crocodilians and amphibians that spent a lot of their time in water have a similar life history strategy in regard to spending more time in water as a mechanism for more keenly regulating their internal body temperature. Why didn't they incorporate some of those lineages into their model as a sort of comparison? Why did they stop at the end of the Permian? they could have easily carried on. Fossil evidence thereafter only increases in quality. Why did they stop? I don't really know. Anyway, I'm getting, including other lineages a little bit further on could have helped their model, especially considering that body sizes of the dinosaurs, for example, were pretty large as well. And so that would have made a pretty interesting comparison. So some discussion questions for everyone, and I'm sorry if I can't be there, so hopefully this helps spur conversation. Question 1, how did this paper influence the future study of thermoregulation, especially in an evolutionary context? So basically between the publication of this paper and the Buckley et al. Paper in 2015, which ties in even climate change. So, well, good question, Mitchell. I don't know. I would think that that this paper seems to be pretty seminal, and it probably influenced the field of certainly mammal physiology studies, especially thermal studies, through time. And it seems to me to be a pretty foundational paper, although this being very far flung from anything I've really read in detail before, I don't know. So insert about 10 minutes of 5-10 minutes of conversation right there, maybe. This is the part where I would be quiet. So question 2, how does living in water increase control and body temperature relative to air? I didn't really understand why they thought that could increase the efficiency of thermoregulation. It seems to me that living in water favors ectothermy. A lot of reptiles are able to successfully live in water. Other ectotherms as well. I think fish, things that do not as keenly regulate. They're not homeothermic. Certainly, it seems that living in water seems to be more advantageous for ectotherms relative to homeotherms, just because of the caloric cost of living in water. So I think of like this in terms of marine mammals, which tend to have a lot of fat insulation in order to persist in really water, which is relatively cold. It has a high specific heat capacity. So I guess I'm just not, my mind isn't really connecting the dots of how living in water could actually have enabled these Permian reptiles to more keenly control their heat transfer, more firmly regulate their heat control. Good question, Mitchell. I don't know the answer, but I'm sure other people could say way more than me. Another interesting thing, I just found this picture online. This genus Dimetrodon, which is sort of a mid-Permian genus, that has a pretty wide diversity of body sizes, from about the size of a cat to like much bigger. There's a human scale right there. So pretty diverse array of sizes, yet pretty similar body shape. And this paper was positing that body shape, specifically changes in like ancillary appendages like tails, was probably prime to how these Permian reptiles were able to more keenly control their homeothermy and body temperature. And yet I see a pretty consistent body shape, a diversity of sizes and yet body shapes. They all have long tails, for example, and they all have these dorsal fins. So, okay, similar shapes, different sizes. That's just kind of confusing to me. I wonder if we could talk about that for 3 minutes. And then lastly, this just kind of bothered me. Why did they use the word inertial homeotherms? Did they mean initial? Inertial kind of is a factor of like movement in, maybe they were thinking about it in terms of movement, in terms of their body temperatures and their body sizes. But movement didn't seem to be the most key thing to me here. It mostly was in terms of external forces and then internal body flow. that you know, so and unless they were thinking about it in terms of locomotion, which they did consider a little bit, but not too much, why are they using the term inertial? I don't really understand. Did they really mean initial? Maybe that's just a weird interpretation on my part. I don't know. But anyway, I know I went over 5 minutes here, but again, you know, hopefully this will stimulate some conversation. I still hope to be involved in the conversation tomorrow. But at this point, I've probably gone over my allotted time, and maybe you've stopped me already by now. So, you know, you have control over the pause button. So with that, um, sorry I'm in jury duty, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you next week.